Have you ever felt too small, too weak, or too insignificant to make a difference? Well, today's story will blow your mind. Imagine defeating a massive army with only 300 soldiers. Sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what happened when God chose Gideon, an ordinary man from an ordinary tribe, to lead an extraordinary victory. In this episode, we'll unravel the incredible journey of Gideon, the unlikely hero who trusted in God's power rather than human strength. Buckle up for a tale of faith, courage, and divine intervention that proves numbers don't matter when God's on your side. Let's set the stage. God's chosen people, the Israelites, were in deep trouble. For 7 years, they were oppressed by the Midianites, a nomadic tribe known for their cruelty and dominance. The Midianites, along with their allies, would swarm into Israel like a plague of locusts. They destroyed crops, raided villages, and left the Israelites in a state of poverty and fear. Things were so bad that many Israelites fled to the mountains, hiding in caves to escape the Midianite onslaught. Why? This was no mere accident of bad luck. Israel had been acting against God by worshiping the idols they had set up, rejecting His instructions. Therefore, God gave their foes power over them to crush them. But still, in all His mercy, God did hear their cries and saw that He would deliver them once more. But not an old, experienced fighter, God now called to the job Gideon. When we first read about Gideon, he doesn't exactly look like the hero type. In fact, he is hiding in a wine press, threshing wheat to keep it hidden from the Midianites. Gideon is cautious, even fearful, but that's when the angel of the Lord appears with a stunning message. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's response? Confusion and doubt. If the Lord is with us, he asks, why has all this happened to us? Where are all His wonders that our ancestors told us about? Gideon wasn't just questioning his own abilities, he was questioning God's presence and power. But God saw something in Gideon that Gideon couldn't see in himself. The Lord said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" This divine assurance notwithstanding, Gideon was not yet ready to trust fully. He asked for a sign, and God delivered. First, fire consumed an offering that Gideon prepared. Then, to further strengthen Gideon's faith, God performed the famous fleece test, making a wool fleece wet with dew while the surrounding ground stayed dry, and then reversing the miracle the next day. God's patience with Gideon's doubts shows that He understands our human frailties. Gideon did not start out as a fearless warrior, but was about to become one through God's guidance. With his faith now strengthened, Gideon prepared an army to confront the Midianites. He was able to muster 32,000 men, a respectable force, yet still woefully outnumbered by the enemy. But God had other plans. He told Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, 'My own strength has saved me.'" Too many men? That must have sounded absurd to Gideon. But God was teaching a crucial lesson. Victory comes from Him, not human strength or numbers. So God instructed Gideon to send home any soldier who was afraid. 22,000 men left, leaving only 10,000. At this time, too, God still felt that there were too many men. He directed Gideon to take the men by a brook and watched how they were drinking the water. Those who could lap up the water at their mouths with their hand were retained, 300 in all, and the others he sent back. Imagine Gideon's thinking at this point. He was now facing an enemy who was thick as locusts, and his army was but 300 men. And yet, he obeyed God, knowing that this had to be part of something much larger. With such a tiny army, Gideon waited to hear what would happen next. And what did come was not a human battle strategy. It was a divine blueprint for victory. God told Gideon to take his servant Purah and go down into the Midianite camp at night. There they listened as 2 enemy soldiers discussed a dream. In the dream, a loaf of barley bread fell into the Midianite camp, toppling a tent. One soldier interpreted the dream. This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Encouraged by this, Gideon went back to his camp with renewed confidence. He divided his 300 men into 3 groups and gave each soldier a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch inside the jar. No swords, no spears, just these simple items. At Gideon's signal, the men surrounded the camp of Midian. They then blew in their trumpets, crushed their jars, and shouted, saying, "The sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The sudden confusion, lights, and noise resulted in a very frightened set of Midianites. Convinced that they had experienced an attack, the Midianites launched at one another with their swords. Those who survived ran away fearing. Gideon's 300 men followed after the enemy, and quickly the Israelites from the other tribes joined to help complete the task. Victory was complete, and the Midianite oppression was broken. The story of Gideon is very rich in lessons for us today. It reminds us that God many times chooses the most unlikely folks to fulfill his purposes. Gideon certainly wasn't a mighty warrior when God called him. He was a hesitant, fearful man. But God saw potential and equipped him for the task. The second is that through Gideon's journey, he learned to trust in God and not to depend on his own power. When God reduced his army from 32,000 down to 300, one could say that was sure suicide. But God was the way of doing it in order for the Israelites to know it was really his hand. Thirdly, the story of Gideon teaches obedience. Even when God's instructions seemed strange, such as choosing soldiers based on how they drank water, attacking with trumpets and jars, Gideon obeyed unconditionally. His trust and obedience made way for an incredible victory. Finally, Gideon's story speaks to the power of faith. Of course, doubts are natural, just like Gideon. But as we bring our doubts to God and seek his guidance, he meets us where we are and strengthens our faith. Before Gideon and his 300 men engaged the Midianites, something critical happened. Preparation and assurance. Gideon needed to be spiritually, mentally, and emotionally prepared, and God did not just cast him into battle unprepared. Rather, God took the time to build up Gideon's confidence and to make sure he knew that victory would come through divine power, not human effort. After choosing the 300 soldiers, God gave Gideon a particular command. "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands." If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. Notice how God acknowledged Gideon's fear. He did not rebuke him for it. Instead, he made a way for Gideon to gain the courage he needed. So Gideon and Purah came quietly to the edge of the Midianite camp. There they listened as 2 enemy soldiers were talking to each other. One soldier reported a dream. "I had a dream that a loaf of barley bread tumbled into our camp, hitting a tent with such force that it overturned and collapsed." The other soldier immediately interpreted the dream, saying, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." What a glorious moment. It wasn't a regular conversation. It was God's confirmation to increase Gideon's faith. Gideon bowed down before him after he heard the dream as well as its interpretation, and his fear became the place of confidence and appreciation. He went back into the Israelite camp and stood before them and said, "Rise, for the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." This part of Gideon's story highlights a few key lessons. First, God understands our fears and doubts. He doesn't demand that we have unwavering faith from the start. Instead, he meets us where we are and provides the encouragement we need. Second, preparation is as much about spiritual readiness as it is about strategy. Before the battle began, Gideon's heart was aligned with God's will, and he fully trusted in God's plan. Finally, this section underlines the importance of listening and observing. Gideon's confidence was strengthened not by his own logic or reasoning, but by seeing God's power and hearing the confirmation directly from his enemies. It's a reminder that God's assurances can come from the most unexpected places, even from those who oppose us. With his faith renewed and his spirit emboldened, Gideon was set to lead his small band of warriors into a battle that would forever showcase God's glory and deliverance. After this great victory over the Midianites, Gideon became a celebrated leader in Israel. People even asked him to be their king, but Gideon refused, saying, "The Lord will rule over you." This statement underscored Gideon's understanding that the victory belonged to God, not him. But Gideon's later years were not perfect. He made an ephod, a priestly dress, which became a snare for the Israelites, and they began to worship it, leading to idolatry once again. It's a cautionary note that even the most faithful leaders could fall, and we should remain vigilant in our devotion to God. Despite this failure, Gideon's impact on Israel was such that the land enjoyed peace within his lifetime for 40 years. His story stands, therefore, as a strong word of what God can do and accomplish through those who feel small and weak, providing they trust and obey him fully. Gideon's story is one of the most inspiring accounts in the Bible. It reminds us that God can use anyone, regardless of background or insecurities, to accomplish great things. It's a story of faith over fear, divine strength over human weakness, and victory against all odds. What keeps you from moving forward then? Are you waiting on proper circumstances, more resources, or an increase in confidence? Actually, God doesn't call the equipped. He equips those called. You might think Gideon, hesitant and doubted, but when you do place your trust in the Lord, the impossible may occur. If Gideon could lead 300 men to defeat a vast army, imagine what God can do through you. Share your thoughts in the comments. What's your Midianite battle, and how will you trust God to lead you to victory? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more incredible Bible stories.